modern superheroes.
Marat Gabidullin was no ordinary soldier. A former commander in the shadowy and infamous Wagner group, he lived through the chaos of war, the ruthlessness of power, and the moral decay of unchecked violence. Yet, against all odds, he turned against the very machine that once defined his life. In a world where silence means survival, Marat did the unthinkable. He chose to speak. The question isn't just why he risked everything to expose his own army's crimes, but what he uncovered and the staggering truth about the invisible forces shaping modern conflict. What kind of man willingly walks away from power and privilege to embrace danger, isolation, and relentless pursuit? And what happens when the most dangerous secrets of a shadow empire are laid bare? Marat Gabidullin isn't just a soldier turned whistleblower. He's a symbol of the fight for truth in a world desperate to bury it. Marat Gabidullin was no ordinary soldier. A former commander in the shadowy and infamous Wagner group, he lived through the chaos of war, the ruthlessness of power, and the moral decay of unchecked violence. Yet, against all odds, he turned against the very machine that once defined his life. In a world where silence means survival, Marat did the unthinkable. He chose to speak. The question isn't just why he risked everything to expose his own army's crimes, but what he uncovered and the staggering truth about the invisible forces shaping modern conflict. What kind of man willingly walks away from power and privilege to embrace danger, isolation, and relentless pursuit? And what happens when the most dangerous secrets of a shadow empire are laid bare? Marat Gabidullin isn't just a soldier turned whistleblower. He's a symbol of the fight for truth in a world desperate to bury it. The Wagner Group isn't a name most people know, yet its impact ripples through some of the most volatile conflicts in the world. Officially, it doesn't exist. Russia denies any affiliation, but the truth tells a far darker story. Wagner operates as a clandestine force, deployed where the Kremlin seeks influence without accountability. From Ukraine's war-torn Donbass to the oil fields of Syria and the deserts of Africa, Wagner's soldiers have fought, not under the flag of a nation, but in the service of profit and political leverage. At its helm are powerful figures with ties deep within Russia's political elite, including Yevgeny Prigozhin, a man often called Putin's chef for his close relationship with the Russian president. Wagner's fighters are not bound by the rules of war. Instead, they are enforcers of shadowy agendas, using brutality and fear as tools to achieve their objectives. Their operations blur the line between private enterprise and state-controlled warfare, leaving destruction and unaccountable violence in their wake. Marat Gabidullin was no mere participant in this machine. He was a commander. As an officer in Wagner's ranks, Marat carried out missions that would never appear in official records. He witnessed firsthand the secretive nature of its operations, the systemic exploitation of soldiers, and the calculated disregard for human life. His position granted him access to information that few would dare to acknowledge, much less expose. But Marat did expose it. His revelations peeled back the layers of Wagner's operations, detailing its recruitment tactics, funding through state-sanctioned channels, and its use as a tool of hybrid warfare. What makes his testimony so vital is not just the content of his words, but the stakes involved. He wasn't just betraying an organization. He was standing against a state power that views defectors as traitors. By coming forward, Marat became a target. His knowledge posed a threat not only to Wagner, but to the Russian state itself. The details he revealed struck at the heart of Russia's international strategy, undermining its carefully constructed deniability. For the global community, his story offers a rare window into the mechanics of modern mercenary warfare and the unholy alliances that drive it. Marat's courage illuminates the murky boundaries of power, showing how shadow armies shape conflicts and destabilize regions. His whistleblowing isn't just a tale of personal bravery. It's a critical warning about a new breed of warfare that thrives on secrecy and unchecked power. Through his voice, the world can no longer ignore what Wagner represents or the global implications of its actions. What drives a man to betray the bonds of brotherhood forged in the fires of war? For Marat Gabidullin, the answer lies in the unspeakable truth he could no longer ignore. His journey from loyal commander to whistleblower is riddled with moments that challenge our very understanding of morality and the human cost of unchecked power. Marat speaks of systemic abuses within Wagner, a place where men are treated as disposable tools, sent to die in battles that will never make the headlines. He witnessed firsthand the exploitation of prisoners, coerced into fighting in exchange for false promises of freedom. He tells of brutal operations in war zones like Syria, where Wagner forces carried out atrocities that would horrify even the most hardened soldiers. One story stands out. the horrifying fate of two captured fighters who were brutally executed by Wagner operatives. Marat describes it in chilling detail, the violence, the inhumanity, and the silence that followed, as if their deaths were routine. These moments, seared into his memory, formed cracks in the foundation of his loyalty, forcing him to question the very purpose of his service. And then there's the turning point, a moment of profound clarity when Marat realized he could no longer remain complicit. Was it seeing comrades treated as expendable, sent into battles with obsolete equipment and no support? Was it the lies told to the world to cover Wagner's tracks? Or was it the realization that he was part of a machine profiting off human suffering? Marat's revelations didn't just expose a rogue organization, they unveiled the hidden mechanisms of power behind it. He unearthed the financial pipelines that funneled state resources into Wagner's operations and the close ties between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the highest echelons of Russian leadership. He revealed the chilling efficiency with which Wagner operates, from its shadowy recruitment networks to its brutal suppression of dissent within its ranks. But Marat's story is not just one of darkness. It's a tale of redemption, of a man who chose to risk everything to tell the truth. As he began to break ranks, every step brought new dangers. The threats from those he once served alongside became more real with each revelation. Yet, he persisted, driven by a moral awakening that could not be silenced. These are the moments that define Marat Gabidullin. His story is not just about what he revealed, but why he chose to reveal it, and the cost he paid to bring these truths to light. What was it that pushed him to finally speak out? And what does it take for a man to turn against an empire of shadows? The answers lie within Marat's extraordinary journey. Marat Gabidullin's journey began in the quiet stillness of a small Russian town, far from the chaos that would later consume his life. Born into a modest family, he grew up in an environment where discipline was not just a value, but a way of survival. His early years were shaped by the teachings of resilience, hard work, and a quiet determination to rise above the limitations of his circumstances. From a young age, Marat was drawn to the idea of service and structure. The military, with its promises of purpose and honor, seemed like a natural fit. Driven by a desire to carve out a path for himself, he enrolled in a military academy, excelling in the physically demanding routines and absorbing the lessons of strategy and leadership. The institution became more than just a school. It was a crucible, shaping him into a disciplined and highly skilled soldier. Marat stood out among his peers, not just for his physical abilities, but for his keen intellect and sense of responsibility. In a world where survival often meant looking out for oneself, he demonstrated an uncommon willingness to support his comrades, a trait that earned him both respect and loyalty. His instructors saw in him the qualities of a leader, someone who could command others not through fear but through trust and example. But beneath the surface of his growing success, cracks were beginning to form. Even as Marat advanced, he became increasingly aware of the systemic failures that plagued the institutions he served. Corruption lurked in the shadows, favoritism dictated promotions, and the welfare of soldiers was often sacrificed for the convenience of those in power. For every moment of triumph, there was a reminder that the system he believed in was deeply flawed. These early experiences planted the seeds of disillusionment, though Marat, then a young officer, buried them under a sense of duty and ambition. His early career brought a mix of achievements and frustrations. Marat proved himself in training exercises and smaller operations, earning the respect of his peers. He saw combat simulations and drills as opportunities to push himself and others to their limits, creating bonds of brotherhood that he thought would last a lifetime. Yet, he could not ignore the signs of a system designed to exploit rather than support its own. Equipment shortages, negligence from higher-ups, and the lack of real opportunities for soldiers to grow gnawed at his belief in the ideals he had once embraced. Still, he pressed forward. Marat was not the type to back down from challenges, even when faced with impossible odds. His commanding presence and ability to lead others through difficult situations made him a natural choice for roles that demanded both bravery and tactical thinking. Yet, the deeper he delved into the military world, the more he began to see the cracks in the foundation. Outside of the military, Marat harbored dreams of a simpler life, one where service could coexist with personal fulfillment. He envisioned a future where the values of loyalty, honor, and service he had been taught could truly make a difference. However, reality was far less forgiving. The deeper he immersed himself in his career, the more he realized that the ideals he cherished were often sacrificed in the name of convenience, power, and profit. This dissonance began to weigh heavily on him. Marat's ambitions remained tied to service, but he was becoming increasingly aware of the cost. The camaraderie he once valued began to feel hollow in the face of growing ethical compromises. The very institution that had promised him a sense of purpose now seemed like a labyrinth of moral decay. The constant tension between his values and the reality of his environment began to take its toll. Despite these growing doubts, Marat did not yet see a way out. For years, he told himself that he could make a difference from within, that his efforts would matter in the grand scheme of things. But the system he served was not designed for change. It was a machine, and everyone within it was expendable, including him. And though he did not yet know it, these early frustrations would one day drive him to break away completely. This was Marat Gabidullin before Wagner, a man forged by discipline, determined to serve but slowly awakening to the harsh realities of the system he had dedicated his life to. A soldier who had yet to realize that his greatest battle would not be on the front lines, but within his own conscience. These years were a slow awakening, laying the foundation for the extraordinary choices he would make in the future. Marat Gabidullin's transition into Wagner was not an immediate decision, but the culmination of circumstances and a search for meaning in a career that had begun to feel stagnant. By the time the opportunity came to join the infamous private military company, Marat had already proven himself a capable leader. His years in the military had honed his skills in combat strategy, leadership, and resilience. Yet, the systemic flaws of the regular forces had left him disillusioned. Wagner, with its promise of autonomy and prestige, appeared to be a way to reclaim purpose. The allure of Wagner was undeniable. For someone with Marat's background, it offered what the conventional military could not: better pay, more advanced equipment, and the chance to operate on a global stage. Wagner presented itself as an elite organization. Its operatives were described as the best of the best of the best of the best, hand-picked for missions that demanded exceptional skill and discretion. For someone who had grown frustrated with bureaucracy and corruption, Wagner appeared to be a chance to finally put his abilities to meaningful use. Marat's recruitment into Wagner came at a pivotal time in his life. The organization was seeking individuals with his particular blend of experience and discipline. It wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about the ability to command under pressure, to navigate chaos, and to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Marat fit the profile perfectly. At first, Wagner lived up to its promise. The training was rigorous, the missions highly specialized, and the camaraderie among operatives felt genuine. Marat was introduced to a world where the rules of engagement were less constrained, where he could focus on executing missions without the bureaucratic hurdles he had come to resent. He was deployed to conflict zones, like Syria, where Wagner operatives played pivotal roles in supporting Russian geopolitical interests. These missions were dangerous, but they offered Marat a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. However, the cracks in Wagner's carefully curated image began to appear almost immediately. Marat quickly realized that behind the facade of professionalism lay a deeply flawed system. The reality was far from the prestige he had been promised. Wagner was not an elite force bound by honor, but a ruthless machine driven by profit and political ambition. Its operatives, despite their skill, were treated as expendable assets, sent into the most dangerous situations with minimal regard for their safety. The brutality of Wagner's operations became apparent in the field. Marat witnessed firsthand the organization's indifference to human life, not just the lives of their enemies, but of their own men. Missions were often carried out with outdated equipment, and support for operatives in the field was unreliable at best. Promises of protection and reward were hollow, as casualties were ignored or covered up to maintain Wagner's reputation. Worse still was the moral cost of the work. Marat's missions often involved actions that blurred or outright crossed ethical boundaries. He saw Wagner's operatives engage in looting, brutality, and acts that went far beyond the scope of legitimate military operations. The atrocities he witnessed in Syria were particularly haunting, as Wagner's presence there wasn't just about military objectives. It was about securing profits for the powerful individuals who controlled the organization. Marat began to see Wagner for what it truly was, a tool of shadow warfare operating in the gray areas of legality and morality. The organization's true purpose wasn't about honor or service, but about advancing agendas that benefited the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Wagner wasn't a refuge from the corruption of the conventional military. It was an amplified version of it, operating without accountability. The prestige that had initially drawn Marat to Wagner was now a distant memory. What he had hoped would be a chance to serve with honor became a daily struggle with his conscience. Yet he remained, driven by a sense of duty to his comrades and a belief that he might still find meaning in the chaos. What Marat didn't know was that his time in Wagner was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of his transformation, a path that would lead him from complicity to defiance. Marat Gabidullin entered Wagner with a sense of purpose, determined to prove himself in an elite force that operated beyond the constraints of traditional military service. In the beginning, his loyalty was unwavering. He believed in the narrative Wagner sold, a brotherhood of highly skilled operatives united by duty, professionalism, and an unspoken code of honor. For a time, this belief sustained him through the chaos and danger of his missions. His early experiences in Wagner reinforced this loyalty. Deployed to some of the world's most volatile conflict zones, Marat found himself leading teams through intense battles. He vividly recalls one mission in Syria, a night assault on a fortified enemy position. Under fire and facing heavy casualties, his leadership turned the tide of the battle. His ability to stay calm, strategize, and rally his men earned him respect within the ranks. Moments like these gave Marat a sense of pride and camaraderie, a fleeting confirmation that he had found his place among warriors who understood the stakes. But as the missions continued, Marat began to see cracks in Wagner's carefully constructed facade. The organization's promises of professionalism and care for its operatives began to falter. The equipment they were provided often fell far short of what was needed for the challenges they faced. Many of his comrades, men who had placed their trust in Wagner, were sent into near-suicidal missions with little support. Promises of compensation for injuries or death were seldom honored. For every victory Marat achieved, there was a shadow of exploitation and neglect. The brutality of the missions took a toll as well. Marat witnessed atrocities that challenged the very idea of honor in combat. In one particularly haunting instance, a group of captured combatants was summarily executed, not by enemy forces, but by Wagner operatives. The memory of their screams and the cold indifference of his comrades stayed with Marat, a grim reminder of how far the organization's actions had strayed from any semblance of morality. He began to question whether he could justify his role in such acts, even as a bystander. Despite these doubts, Marat's sense of loyalty persisted, anchored by his relationships with his comrades. The bonds forged in the heat of battle were not easily broken. He felt a deep responsibility to the men who fought alongside him, men who, like him, had been drawn to Wagner by promises of purpose and professionalism. Yet, even these bonds began to strain under the weight of what they endured. The trust that once defined their camaraderie was eroded by the organization's indifference to their welfare and the ethical compromises they were forced to make. One of the most poignant moments of inner conflict came during a mission in Africa, where Wagner was deployed to protect lucrative mining interests. The mission was not about justice, security, or even geopolitical strategy, it was about profit. As Marat led his team through a skirmish with local insurgents, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not heroes, but mercenaries serving a cause devoid of meaning. The violence, once a necessary means to an end, began to feel senseless. Marat's inner conflict deepened as the reality of Wagner's operations became impossible to ignore. The organization's leadership showed little regard for the lives of its operatives, treating them as disposable assets. Injured soldiers were abandoned, their sacrifices unacknowledged. Promises of financial security for their families were often unfulfilled, leaving widows and children to fend for themselves. The values that Marat had once held dear, loyalty, honor, and duty, seemed increasingly out of reach. Yet, leaving Wagner was not an option Marat could easily entertain. The organization had a way of keeping its operatives tied to it, whether through fear, loyalty, or a sense of inevitability. For Marat, the bonds of brotherhood were a double-edged sword, both a source of strength and a chain that held him in place. He found himself caught between his commitment to his comrades and the growing realization that he was part of something deeply corrupt. Marat's loyalty, once unwavering, now existed alongside a gnawing sense of doubt. The cracks in Wagner's facade had grown too large to ignore, and he began to question not just the organization but himself. How could he reconcile his role in something that so clearly violated his principles? This inner conflict would define Marat's journey in Wagner, setting the stage for the moral awakening that would ultimately lead him to break ranks. For now, though, he remained in the shadows, torn between his sense of duty and the growing need to confront the truth. The Wagner Group operates in a world of shadows, where power thrives on secrecy and deniability. Officially, Wagner doesn't exist. Its name absent from Russian military registries, its operations unacknowledged by the state. Yet, it is a key instrument of Russian influence, designed to carry out missions that regular forces cannot, all while maintaining plausible deniability for the Kremlin. For Marat Gabidullin, understanding Wagner's true nature became a journey into a labyrinth of power, greed, and exploitation. At its core, Wagner is not a private military company in the traditional sense. It is a hybrid entity, deeply intertwined with the Russian state. The group was founded by Dmitry Utkin, a former officer of the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency, and its operations are backed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a close ally of President Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin's influence extends far beyond Wagner, encompassing vast business empires that include catering contracts, mining ventures, and more. Wagner's funding flows through these networks, often masked by layers of intermediaries. This intricate system allows the group to operate without leaving direct evidence of state involvement, enabling the Russian government to maintain plausible deniability. Wagner's structure reflects its dual nature as both a military force and a shadowy corporate entity. At the top are figures like Utkin and Prigozhin, who act as the organization's strategists and financiers. Beneath them is a hierarchy of commanders responsible for planning and executing operations. These leaders are drawn from various backgrounds, including former Russian military personnel and even convicted criminals, all united by their willingness to operate outside the bounds of conventional warfare. This hierarchy was vital to maintaining control over an organization that operated in some of the most chaotic and dangerous regions in the world. Marat Gabidullin was one of these commanders, overseeing units in some of Wagner's most perilous missions. His role gave him a unique perspective on the group's operations. He witnessed firsthand how Wagner operated as a tool of the Russian state, used to achieve political and economic objectives in regions where direct military intervention would provoke international condemnation. One of the critical elements of Wagner's operations is its recruitment practices. The group targets individuals who are skilled but vulnerable, former soldiers disillusioned with the regular military, men with criminal records seeking redemption, and even prisoners desperate for freedom. These recruits are promised high pay, camaraderie, and the chance to serve in an elite unit. However, the reality is often far grimmer. Many operatives are treated as expendable, sent on high-risk missions with little regard for their survival. Marat saw how Wagner exploited these recruits, luring them with promises of better lives, but ultimately discarding them when they were no longer useful. Injured operatives were often abandoned without medical care, their contributions erased as if they had never existed. Families of fallen soldiers rarely saw the financial compensation they were promised. For Wagner, operatives were tools, not individuals, and their value was measured only by their immediate utility on the battlefield. The group's operations are a study in contrasts. On one hand, the group is highly organized, with rigorous training programs and a strict chain of command. Marat described how new recruits underwent intensive preparation, learning advanced tactics and specialized skills for missions that ranged from combat to intelligence gathering. On the other hand, the group's missions often descended into chaos, marked by poor planning and a disregard for the lives of its operatives. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of Wagner's operations is its role in advancing both economic and political objectives. In Syria, Wagner forces weren't just fighting insurgents. They were securing oil fields and protecting infrastructure that directly benefited Prigozhin's business interests. In Africa, Wagner's presence ensured access to lucrative mining contracts and strengthened authoritarian regimes aligned with Moscow's goals. These missions, while framed as military operations, were ultimately about profit, consolidating power for the elites who controlled Wagner. Marat's role within Wagner placed him at the center of these operations. As a commander, he was responsible for leading men into battle, navigating the complexities of war while grappling with the moral compromises required by his position. He saw how the organization operated not just as a military entity, but as a business, one where profit often outweighed strategy or human life. Wagner's commanders, including Marat, were caught in a system that demanded results at any cost, leaving little room for dissent or reflection. The indifference to human life extended to the civilians caught in the crossfire of Wagner's missions. In Syria, Marat witnessed operations that involved indiscriminate violence against local populations, actions justified as necessary for securing objectives, but which left destruction and resentment in their wake. These actions weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader strategy that prioritized outcomes over ethics, a strategy that often blurred the line between combat and outright war crimes. For Marat, understanding Wagner's anatomy was both a privilege and a burden. His position allowed him to see the intricate web of connections that sustained the group, from its financial backers to its political patrons. Yet, this knowledge also exposed him to the darker truths of its operations, the exploitation, the corruption, and the indifference to human suffering. Wagner was not just a shadow army, it was a mirror reflecting the systemic rot of the powers it served. Wagner's shadowy nature didn't just enable it to operate, It made it a formidable weapon in the Kremlin's arsenal. Its ability to infiltrate conflict zones, undermine governments, and extract resources created a ripple effect that destabilized entire regions. This was the machine Marat had become a part of, a machine he would one day turn against. But at this point in his journey, he was still inside the labyrinth, grappling with the weight of the knowledge he carried and the role he played in perpetuating a system built on secrecy and exploitation. Marat Gabidullin's missions with Wagner took him to the front lines of some of the most devastating conflicts of the 21st century. In Syria, the war's chaos was magnified by Wagner's presence. The group was deployed to support Bashar al-Assad's regime, but their true purpose extended far beyond military objectives. Protecting oil fields and securing energy infrastructure for private profits became just as important as defeating insurgents. Marat saw firsthand how these dual agendas shaped every decision, often at the expense of human lives. One mission in Syria remains etched in his memory: a brutal assault on a rebel-held town. Wagner operatives were tasked with clearing the area of enemy forces and securing strategic oil facilities nearby. As Marat's unit advanced through the town, the signs of devastation were everywhere. Homes reduced to rubble, streets lined with bodies of civilians caught in the crossfire. The official orders were clear: no hesitation, eliminate resistance, and secure the objective. But for Marat, the reality was far more complex. Many of the so-called enemy combatants were poorly armed locals forced to fight, and the civilian casualties weighed heavily on him. The battle raged for hours, with Marat's team facing fierce resistance. At one point, his unit was pinned down by heavy gunfire from a fortified building. He had to make a decision: either risk the lives of his men in a direct assault or call in airstrikes that would almost certainly kill everyone inside, combatants and civilians alike. He chose the airstrikes, following orders and prioritizing the mission. The explosion obliterated the target, and the resistance crumbled, but the screams of those trapped inside haunted Marat long after the dust settled. In Ukraine, the nature of Wagner's missions was equally complex, but carried a more personal weight for Marat. The group operated covertly, supporting pro-Russian separatists in the Donbas region. Unlike Syria, where the enemy was often faceless, Ukraine presented a conflict much closer to home. Marat's missions included sabotage, reconnaissance, and direct engagement with Ukrainian forces. Officially, these operations didn't exist. Wagner's presence in Ukraine was denied by Moscow, leaving operatives without the protection or recognition afforded to regular soldiers. One mission outside the city of Debaltseve stands out as a turning point in Marat's moral struggle. His unit was ordered to destroy a bridge critical to Ukrainian supply lines. The operation was successful, but as they retreated, they encountered a group of civilians fleeing the area: men, women, and children caught in the chaos. The order came through to leave no witnesses. Marat hesitated, his instincts screaming against the inhumanity of the command. His men, looking to him for guidance, were divided, unsure whether to follow through. In the end, Marat used his authority to spare the civilians, ordering his team to let them go. It was a small act of defiance, but it carried immense risk. Disobeying orders in Wagner was not only a professional gamble, but a potential death sentence. These moments of moral conflict were not isolated incidents. Marat's missions often placed him at the crossroads of duty and conscience. In one particularly harrowing operation, his team was tasked with defending a Syrian oil field under attack by ISIS. They held their ground for days, outnumbered and under-equipped, sustaining heavy casualties. When reinforcements finally arrived, they brought not supplies or medical aid, but orders to advance into enemy territory and secure more infrastructure. The lives of Marat's men, who had given everything to hold their position, were secondary to the economic interests driving the mission. Wagner's indifference to human life extended even to its own operatives. Injured soldiers were often abandoned on the battlefield, deemed too costly to evacuate. Marat recalls a comrade, a young recruit barely in his 20s, who was left behind during a retreat in Ukraine. His cries for help over the radio went unanswered, and he was eventually captured by enemy forces. The incident left a deep scar on Marat, reinforcing the growing disillusionment with the organization he once believed in. Even the victories felt hollow. Marat recounts a mission in the Palmyra desert, where his unit successfully reclaimed a key position from enemy fighters. The triumph was overshadowed by the looting that followed, as Wagner operatives ransacked the area, taking anything of value. It wasn't just the spoils of war. It was a calculated effort to extract wealth for Wagner's financiers. For Marat, The sight of his comrades scavenging among the ruins of war was a stark reminder of the corruption at the heart of the organization. The cost of these missions wasn't limited to the battlefield. Marat saw the toll it took on his men, the psychological scars, the loss of faith in the mission, and the slow erosion of their humanity. The camaraderie that once united them began to fracture under the weight of these experiences. Men who had once trusted Marat as their leader now questioned the very purpose of their fight, and he could offer them no answers. For Marat, each mission added to the burden he carried. The violence, the moral compromises, and the relentless pursuit of profit over principle left him questioning everything he stood for. Wagner was no longer just an organization. It was a machine that consumed lives, loyalty, and humanity in equal measure. These missions, filled with moments of bravery and horror, defined Marat's time in Wagner. But they also planted the seeds of his eventual defiance, as he began to see the group not as a brotherhood, but as a force of destruction that he could no longer serve. Marat Gabidullin's journey within Wagner was one of mounting tension between loyalty and conscience. For years, he had followed orders, led men into battle, and rationalized the moral compromises as necessary sacrifices for a greater purpose. But there was a moment, a singular, harrowing event, that shattered his justifications and set him on the path to defiance. It was not the bloodiest battle or the most dangerous mission, but a quiet and brutal revelation of Wagner's true nature. The turning point came during a deployment in Syria. Marat's unit had been tasked with defending an oil installation under constant attack from insurgents. For weeks, they held the line, enduring relentless assaults and sustaining heavy casualties. Marat worked tirelessly to keep his men alive, but the reinforcements and supplies they desperately needed never came. It became clear to him that they were expendable, left to fend for themselves while their superiors prioritized the financial interests tied to the oil fields over the lives of those defending them. The final blow came in the aftermath of one particularly grueling engagement. Marat's team had managed to repel a large-scale attack, but at great cost. Among the dead was a young operative named Sergei, a promising soldier who had joined Wagner to support his family back home. Sergei had been gravely injured during the battle, and Marat had personally requested an evacuation to save his life. The response from command was chilling. Leave him. He's not worth the resources. Forced to abandon Sergei, Marat stayed by his side until the young man succumbed to his wounds. As Sergei's life slipped away, Marat saw the hollow promises of Wagner for what they truly were. The organization had no loyalty to its operatives, no respect for their sacrifices. They were assets, valued only as long as they could produce results. When they became liabilities, they were discarded without hesitation. Marat carried Sergei's body back to camp himself, his grief mingling with a growing anger that he could no longer suppress. This event forced Marat to confront the full extent of Wagner's systemic corruption. It wasn't just the disregard for human life. It was the lies that sustained the organization. The promises of honor, camaraderie, and purpose were a facade, masking the greed and exploitation that lay at its core. Wagner's missions weren't about protecting Russian interests or bringing stability to conflict zones. They were about profit, power, and advancing the agendas of the few at the expense of the many. Marat's disillusionment deepened as he began to question not just Wagner's actions, but his own complicity. He thought of the civilians he had seen caught in the crossfire, the looting and atrocities committed under the banner of Wagner, and the men he had led to their deaths for objectives that now seemed meaningless. He had always believed that his service was a necessary evil, a way to bring order to chaos. But now, he realized that he had been a pawn in a much larger game, one that thrived on chaos rather than seeking to end it. The betrayal wasn't limited to the battlefield. Marat uncovered evidence of financial misconduct within Wagner, with funds meant for operatives' pay and benefits siphoned off by those at the top. He learned of families left destitute after their loved ones were killed in action. The promises of compensation and support vanishing into the pockets of Wagner's financiers. These revelations solidified Marat's understanding that Wagner was not just a corrupt organization. It was a machine designed to exploit, enrich, and destroy. One night, sitting alone in his tent, Marat found himself staring at Sergei's empty bunk. The weight of his experiences bore down on him, and he began to write. At first, it was just an attempt to make sense of his thoughts, to process the anger and grief that consumed him. But as the words poured out, he realized he was documenting something far greater, the truth about Wagner. It was a truth that needed to be told, not just for his sake, but for the sake of those who had suffered and died in silence. This moment marked the beginning of Marat's transformation. He could no longer reconcile his role within Wagner with the principles he once held dear. The loyalty that had defined his service was replaced by a new sense of purpose, a determination to expose the corruption and atrocities that Wagner sought to hide. Marat knew the risks of speaking out, but for the first time, he felt a clarity that outweighed his fear. The turning point had come, and there was no going back. Marat Gabidullin's decision to reveal the secrets of Wagner was not made in a single moment. It was a process, a gradual confrontation with his fears, his values, and the overwhelming weight of the truth he carried. Speaking out against an organization like Wagner wasn't just a betrayal of his former comrades. It was an act of defiance against a powerful system that thrived on silence and secrecy. For Marat, the choice to expose Wagner was both a moral imperative and a dangerous gamble. The first barrier Marat faced was fear. Wagner's operatives were bound not only by contracts, but by an unspoken code of silence. Those who dared to speak out risked retaliation, not just against themselves, but against their families. Marat knew what Wagner was capable of. He had seen firsthand how the organization dealt with dissent, using intimidation, exile, or worse to ensure loyalty. The knowledge of these consequences haunted him, but it also fueled his determination. He understood that breaking the silence would mean risking everything he had left. Marat's fears were not unfounded. The stakes of exposing Wagner were immense. The organization wasn't just a rogue group. It was deeply tied to the Russian state. Speaking out against Wagner meant challenging not only its leadership, but the political and economic structures that supported it. Marat wrestled with the implications of his decision, knowing that his revelations would make him a target, not just of Wagner, but of those in power who had the most to lose. At the same time, Marat was plagued by doubt. He questioned whether his voice could make a difference, whether exposing Wagner's secrets would lead to accountability or simply put a spotlight on his betrayal. The weight of guilt was another struggle. Marat had spent years as a part of Wagner, carrying out orders and leading men into missions that often left destruction in their wake. Could he now stand as a whistleblower, knowing his hands were not clean? These doubts were counterbalanced by moments of clarity, flashes of courage that reminded Marat why he had to act. He thought of Sergei, the young soldier abandoned in Syria, and the countless others who had been used and discarded by Wagner. He thought of the families who would never receive answers about their loved ones, the civilians caught in the crossfire, and the lies that continued to perpetuate suffering. For Marat, staying silent would make him complicit in the very corruption he now sought to expose. The practical struggles of his decision were just as daunting. Marat needed a plan, not just to reveal the truth, but to protect himself in the process. He began gathering evidence, documenting his experiences and the operations he had witnessed. This was no small task. Wagner's missions were shrouded in secrecy, with operatives sworn to silence and all official records meticulously concealed. Marat relied on his memory and the fragments of information he could safely compile, knowing that every piece of evidence he collected was a step closer to putting himself in danger. Finding an outlet for his revelations was another challenge. Marat knew that exposing Wagner through traditional channels was impossible. The organization's ties to the Russian government ensured that any attempt to seek justice within the system would be met with resistance or suppression. Instead, he turned to international human rights organizations and journalists, hoping that by bringing his story to the global stage, he could bypass the barriers of state control. The decision to speak out required not only courage, but an immense amount of trust. Marat had to place his faith in individuals and institutions he had never interacted with before, sharing sensitive information that could put his life at even greater risk. Each meeting, each document handed over, was an act of bravery and defiance, a step further away from the shadows of Wagner and closer to the light of truth. Perhaps the most significant struggle Marat faced was internal. He had to reconcile the man he had become with the man he wanted to be. For years, he had justified his actions within Wagner as a necessity, a means to survive and protect his comrades. But now, he understood that true loyalty wasn't about protecting an organization. It was about protecting the values that made him human. Speaking out was his way of reclaiming those values, of taking a stand against the system that had betrayed him and so many others. In the end, Marat's choice to reveal Wagner's secrets was an act of both courage and redemption. It was a decision born of pain, fear, and moral conviction, a refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice. He knew the risks, but he also knew the cost of inaction. For Marat, the choice was clear. He could not change the past, but he could use the truth to shape a better future, even if it meant standing alone against an empire of shadows. Exposing the truth about Wagner was not a single act, but a meticulous, calculated process that required courage, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to justice. For Marat Gabidullin, it began with a single decision to no longer remain silent. But knowing the truth was one thing, proving it and finding a way to make the world listen was another. Every step Marat took was fraught with danger, requiring him to navigate a labyrinth of secrecy, betrayal, and the constant threat of retaliation. The first challenge Marat faced was compiling evidence. Wagner's operations were deliberately shrouded in mystery, with no official documentation of its missions, funding, or chain of command. Operatives were sworn to secrecy, and those who violated this unwritten code often disappeared. Marat relied on his personal experiences, piecing together the events he had witnessed, the orders he had received, and the moments that had pushed him to his breaking point. He began by recording his memories of key missions, details of operations in Syria, Ukraine, and Africa that revealed Wagner's true objectives. One of the most critical pieces of evidence Marat provided came from his time in Syria. He documented the systemic looting of oil fields, where Wagner operatives worked not to protect infrastructure but to secure profits for private interests. Marat described the coordinated efforts to strip resources from the region, with direct ties to Russian business oligarchs. These accounts were not just stories. They were damning evidence of how Wagner operated as both a military and economic instrument of shadow warfare. Marat also gathered testimonies from other disillusioned operatives. Quietly, he reached out to former comrades who had left Wagner or who shared his growing discontent. Some were too afraid to speak, but others, emboldened by Marat's determination, offered their own accounts of exploitation, abandonment, and the atrocities they had witnessed. These testimonies painted a broader picture of Wagner's operations, corroborating Marat's claims and strengthening his case. To ensure the safety of this evidence, Marat had to work in secret. He knew that if Wagner or its backers discovered his efforts, the consequences would be dire. Using encrypted communication and trusted intermediaries, he began to share his findings with human rights organizations and investigative journalists. One of the first groups he contacted was an international NGO focused on exposing war crimes and abuses in conflict zones. This organization became a crucial ally, helping Marat structure his evidence in a way that could withstand scrutiny and have maximum impact. The collaboration with human rights groups was both a lifeline and a turning point. Through them, Marat learned how to frame his revelations not just as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern of systemic abuse and corruption. They provided him with platforms to share his story safely, ensuring that his voice could reach beyond Russia's borders. Marat's accounts were cross-referenced with satellite images, financial records, and other independent sources, creating an irrefutable body of evidence. One particularly poignant moment came during a meeting with representatives from an international tribunal investigating war crimes in Syria. Marat shared his testimony about a mission where Wagner operatives had carried out indiscriminate killings in a small village, targeting civilians under the guise of rooting out insurgents. As he recounted the events, the room fell silent. The weight of his words was undeniable, and Marat could see in their faces that his story was finally being heard. Despite these victories, the process was not without its challenges. Marat often struggled with the emotional toll of reliving his experiences. Each account he shared forced him to confront the horrors he had been a part of, the lives that had been lost, and the role he had played in a system he now sought to dismantle. But with each step, his resolve grew stronger. The fear that had once paralyzed him was replaced by a sense of purpose, a belief that the truth, no matter how painful, needed to come to light. As Marat's revelations began to gain traction, the risks he faced intensified. Wagner operatives and their allies were quick to brand him a traitor, spreading disinformation to discredit his claims and intimidate him into silence. Friends and colleagues from his past distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with his defiance. But Marat found solace in the support of those who believed in his mission, the journalists who amplified his voice, the activists who stood by him, and the families of Wagner's victims who thanked him for his courage. One of the most significant milestones came when Marat's testimony was published in a detailed investigative report by a major international news outlet. The report, which included first-hand accounts, corroborating evidence, and expert analysis, sent shockwaves through the global community. It exposed Wagner's operations in unprecedented detail, sparking calls for accountability and raising awareness about the broader implications of private military forces like Wagner. Through it all, Marat never lost sight of why he had chosen this path. Each piece of evidence he shared, each story he told, was a step toward justice. Not just for himself, but for those who could no longer speak. The process of exposing Wagner was arduous and dangerous, but it was also transformative. For Marat, it was a chance to reclaim his humanity and to ensure that the truth would not die in the shadows. The world now knew what Wagner was, and it could no longer look away. The decision to expose Wagner's secrets thrust Marat Gabidullin into a storm of retaliation, betrayal, and isolation, speaking out against an organization as powerful and ruthless as Wagner came at a price. and Marat quickly realized that the path of truth was as perilous as any battlefield he had ever faced. The backlash began almost immediately after Marat's revelations were made public. Wagner's operatives, true to the group's culture of enforcing loyalty, launched a coordinated campaign to discredit him. Former comrades, men Marat had once trusted with his life, now turned against him, accusing him of fabrication and treason. These weren't just casual denouncements. These were orchestrated attacks designed to undermine his credibility and make him a pariah. The threats to Marat's safety were constant and severe. Wagner had a history of dealing harshly with those who betrayed its code of silence, and Marat was no exception. Anonymous messages warned him to retract his statements or face dire consequences. Some came as veiled threats. Others were blunt and explicit, leaving no doubt about the danger he was in. Surveillance, harassment, and even attempted intimidation of those close to him became a regular part of his life. One of the most chilling incidents occurred late one evening when Marat noticed a car parked outside his apartment, its engine idling for hours. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the weight of being watched, but this time the fear was palpable. A knock on the door came later that night, a package, unmarked, left in silence. Inside was a note with a single word: enough. Marat knew what it meant. Wagner wanted him to stop, to disappear, to abandon his mission of exposing the truth. He also knew he couldn't let them succeed. Perhaps the hardest part of the backlash was the betrayal by those he once called allies. Men he had fought alongside, shared meals with, and trusted implicitly now refused to even acknowledge him. Some out of fear, others out of loyalty to Wagner, and many out of a combination of both. The bonds forged in the crucible of combat dissolved as Marat became an outcast, labeled a traitor by the very people he had once considered brothers. Marat's isolation extended beyond his former comrades. Within the broader Russian community, his whistleblowing was met with a mix of admiration and condemnation. While some lauded his courage, others saw him as a disgrace, a man who had turned against his own. The narrative Wagner pushed, that Marat's claims were lies motivated by self-interest, gained traction in certain circles, leaving him to fend off not just institutional retaliation but also public skepticism. The personal cost of standing against Wagner was immense. Marat's family, who had always been his anchor, faced their own share of harassment and ostracism. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own safety or reputations by associating with him. Marat's world grew smaller, his circle of trust shrinking to a handful of supporters who believed in his mission despite the risks. Financially, the consequences were just as dire. Marat struggled to find stable work, as his reputation had been tarnished by the accusations and threats that followed him. Employers were hesitant to hire someone marked by Wagner, fearing the potential fallout. What little support he received from human rights organizations and journalists was not enough to fully shield him from the economic hardships of his defiance. Yet, through it all, Marat found strength in the clarity of his purpose. The backlash, as overwhelming as it was, only reinforced the importance of his mission. Each attempt to silence him, every threat, and every act of betrayal became further proof of the truths he had uncovered. Wagner's desperation to discredit him revealed the power of the story he was telling and the potential it had to disrupt the status quo. Marat also found solace in the support of those who understood the stakes: human rights advocates, investigative journalists, and the families of Wagner's victims rallied around him, offering both practical assistance and moral encouragement. Their belief in his cause gave him the resilience to keep going, even when the risks seemed insurmountable. In the end, the backlash and risks Marat faced were a testament to the impact of his revelations. The threats, the isolation, the betrayals, they were the price of exposing a powerful institution that thrived on secrecy and impunity. But for Marat, the cost was worth it. He had traded a life in the shadows for a chance to bring the truth into the light, knowing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice could make a difference. Marat Gabidullin's revelations about Wagner didn't just expose the inner workings of a secretive private military group. They pulled back the curtain on a much larger and deeply rooted problem within Russia's military and political landscape. Wagner was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of systemic corruption, a shadowy tool wielded by a state that thrives on deniability and exploitation. Through Marat's story, the cracks in the foundation of Russia's military-industrial complex became impossible to ignore. One of the most glaring issues Marat revealed was the way Wagner operated as an extension of the state's power, blurring the lines between private enterprise and public military strategy. On paper, Wagner was an independent private military company, but in practice, it was a tightly controlled instrument of Russian foreign policy. Its missions often aligned directly with the Kremlin's geopolitical goals, allowing Russia to project power while maintaining plausible deniability. From Syria to Ukraine to Africa, Wagner's actions were part of a larger strategy to destabilize regions, secure resources, and expand influence without the constraints of international accountability. This arrangement was emblematic of a political system built on secrecy and corruption. Wagner's very existence depended on a network of backroom deals, cronyism, and illicit funding. Marat revealed how state resources were funneled into Wagner's operations through intermediaries, disguising government involvement while ensuring that the group had the equipment, manpower, and logistical support it needed to operate. These revelations exposed not just Wagner's methods, but also the complicity of a political elite that prioritized their own agendas over the rule of law. Another systemic issue highlighted by Marat was the exploitation of individuals within the military system. Wagner's recruitment practices targeted society's most vulnerable, disillusioned soldiers, prisoners desperate for freedom, and men with no other options. These individuals were lured with promises of high pay, prestige, and a sense of purpose, only to be treated as disposable assets. Marat described how recruits were often sent into high-risk missions with minimal training and outdated equipment, their lives considered expendable in the pursuit of profit or strategic objectives. This exploitation extended to the families of Wagner operatives, who were frequently left without the promised compensation when their loved ones were killed in action. Marat's accounts of widows and children abandoned by the organization painted a damning picture of a system that preyed on desperation and then discarded those it used. This cycle of exploitation wasn't limited to Wagner. It mirrored the broader corruption within Russia's military institutions, where soldiers were often neglected, underpaid, and treated as tools rather than people. Wagner's operations also revealed the broader economic motivations driving Russia's foreign policy. Marat detailed how Wagner's missions were often less about military objectives and more about securing financial interests. In Syria, for example, the protection of oil fields and energy infrastructure was a priority not because of strategic necessity, but because those resources funneled wealth directly into the pockets of Wagner's financiers. These economic agendas, hidden behind the guise of military operations, highlighted the extent to which private greed and state strategy had become inseparable. At the heart of this corruption was a culture of impunity. Wagner operated outside the bounds of international law, committing atrocities and war crimes with no fear of accountability. This lack of oversight wasn't just a failure of the organization. It was a deliberate feature of the system that created it. By outsourcing its dirtiest work to groups like Wagner, the Russian state could achieve its goals while evading responsibility for the consequences. This culture of impunity extended far beyond Wagner, reflecting a broader disregard for transparency, accountability, and the rule of law within Russia's political and military institutions. Marat's testimony also highlighted how propaganda played a critical role in sustaining this system. Wagner's operatives were fed a steady diet of nationalistic rhetoric, portraying their missions as acts of patriotism and their sacrifices as noble contributions to Russia's greatness. This narrative masked the true nature of their work, creating a facade of honor and duty that many operatives only saw through when it was too late. For Marat, this propaganda was not just a tool for recruitment. It was a means of perpetuating a corrupt system by keeping its participants loyal and compliant. The systemic corruption Marat exposed didn't just affect Wagner's operatives or the regions where the group operated, it had global implications. Wagner's actions destabilized entire nations, exacerbating conflicts, undermining democratic institutions, and fueling cycles of violence. The group's operations were a stark reminder of how unchecked power and corruption could ripple outward, creating consequences that extended far beyond the borders of any one country. Marat's revelations forced the world to confront the reality of Wagner and what it represented. His story was not just about one man's journey, but about the deep-seated flaws in a system that allowed such an organization to thrive. Wagner was a symptom, but the disease was much larger, a political and military apparatus built on exploitation, impunity, and the prioritization of power over principles. By exposing these truths, Marat shed light on a system that thrives in darkness, challenging the world to demand accountability and change. The truth is often a heavy burden, and for Marat Gabidullin, the cost of carrying it was immense. Whistleblowing against an organization like Wagner, with its deep ties to power and its ruthless methods of control, meant stepping into a world of isolation and constant danger. But it wasn't just his own life that was altered. His revelations rippled outward, forcing others to confront uncomfortable realities about loyalty, morality, and the systems that allow such organizations to thrive. The personal and societal costs of Marat's decision to expose the truth about Wagner were profound. One of the most immediate and devastating costs was isolation. Marat had spent years building relationships within Wagner, forging bonds with men who had trusted him as their commander. These were individuals he had fought beside, shared meals with, and relied on in moments of life and death. But the moment he chose to break ranks and speak out, those bonds were severed. Friends turned their backs, fearing association with a man branded as a traitor. Others, still loyal to Wagner, viewed him with contempt, their anger fueled by a sense of betrayal. Marat's isolation extended beyond his former comrades. The tight-knit community he had once been part of now saw him as a pariah. Even those outside Wagner, in his personal life, grew distant, wary of the danger his actions brought. The whispers, the side glances, the avoidance, it all became part of his daily reality. The choice to tell the truth had cost him not only his safety but the sense of belonging that had once defined his identity. The danger Marat faced was constant and unrelenting. Wagner had a reputation for dealing harshly with those who broke its code of silence. Retaliation wasn't just a threat, it was a certainty. Marat lived with the knowledge that he was a target, that any moment could bring an attack, an attempt to silence him forever. The pressure was suffocating. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every anonymous phone call was a reminder that his life was no longer his own. Beyond the immediate physical danger, Marat faced a more insidious form of retaliation, discrediting. Wagner's allies worked tirelessly to tarnish his reputation, spreading disinformation and framing him as a liar motivated by personal gain. The media, often under the influence of state propaganda, amplified these narratives, making Marat's fight for truth even harder. The constant battle to defend his integrity was exhausting, forcing him to relive his experiences over and over in an attempt to prove their validity. Marat also faced the emotional toll of his decision, reliving the horrors of Wagner's operations, recounting the moments that had driven him to break away, took a deep psychological toll. He was haunted by memories of missions that ended in needless death, of comrades lost, and of the civilians who had suffered under Wagner's brutal campaigns. Every story he told, every piece of evidence he shared, forced him to confront the role he had played in the very system he now sought to expose. The weight of guilt was immense, a constant reminder of the cost of both his past actions and his present defiance. Despite these challenges, Marat persisted, driven by a deep sense of responsibility. He understood that the truth was not just his burden to bear, it was a weapon against the corruption and violence he had once been complicit in. For every setback, every threat, every moment of doubt, Marat found strength in the knowledge that his actions could make a difference. He wasn't just exposing Wagner, he was standing up for the countless individuals who had suffered in silence, their voices drowned out by the machinery of power. The societal cost of Marat's whistleblowing was equally significant. His revelations forced a reckoning, both within Russia and internationally. For many, his story was a painful reminder of the complicity required to sustain systems like Wagner. Soldiers, families, and even ordinary citizens were confronted with uncomfortable questions about loyalty, morality, and the price of silence. Marat's testimony revealed not only the corruption within Wagner, but the broader culture of impunity that allowed it to thrive. Internationally, Marat's revelations ignited debates about accountability, the role of private military groups, and the responsibilities of governments in addressing these issues. His story became a rallying cry for human rights organizations, journalists, and activists, but it also underscored the challenges of combating such deeply entrenched systems. For all the awareness Marat's actions generated, the fight for justice was far from over, and the path forward remained fraught with obstacles. Through it all, Marat's strength was a beacon. Despite the personal and societal costs, he remained steadfast in his mission, refusing to let fear or doubt silence him. His courage was not born of a lack of fear, but of his ability to confront it head-on, to persist in the face of overwhelming odds. Marat Gabidullin's story is a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit, even when the cost seems unbearable. He stood alone against an empire of shadows, proving that one voice, armed with the truth, can indeed make a difference. Marat's courage also created ripples in unexpected places. Families of other Wagner operatives reached out to him privately, sharing their gratitude and sorrow. Many told him of loved ones who had vanished or died in mysterious circumstances while serving the organization. His revelations gave them a voice, a chance to grieve openly for the first time. Marat became not just a whistleblower, but a symbol of resistance against a system that had taken so much from so many. In these quiet moments, Marat found validation for his sacrifices and a reason to keep going. Marat Gabidullin's decision to expose the inner workings of Wagner was more than a personal act of defiance. It was a call to justice that resonated far beyond his own experiences. By shedding light on the corruption, exploitation, and violence inherent in Wagner's operations, Marat forced the world to confront the systemic issues that allowed such organizations to thrive. His actions were a challenge to the culture of impunity that surrounded not only Wagner but the entire network of shadowy power structures supporting it. The implications of his whistleblowing are profound, highlighting both the urgency of accountability and the broader fight against corruption in global systems. One of the most immediate implications of Marat's revelations is the challenge they pose to the idea of private military forces operating without oversight. Wagner, with its close ties to the Russian state, exemplifies how private groups can be weaponized for geopolitical goals while evading accountability. Marat's testimony exposed the dark reality behind the facade of Wagner as a private entity. By revealing its operations, financial structures, and ties to the Kremlin, Marat undermined the deniability that had shielded both Wagner and the Russian government from scrutiny. His story also brought attention to the broader trend of privatized warfare, where profit-driven organizations exploit conflict zones for financial and political gain. Marat's account of Wagner's missions in Syria and Africa showed how the pursuit of resources and wealth often takes precedence over the welfare of local populations and operatives. This model, unchecked, sets a dangerous precedent, enabling powerful entities to destabilize regions while avoiding the consequences that state actors might face under international law. Marat's revelations sparked global conversations about accountability. Human rights organizations, journalists, and governments began to focus more intently on Wagner's activities, using his testimony as a foundation for further investigations. His courage inspired others to come forward, creating a ripple effect that made it harder for Wagner and similar groups to operate in the shadows. In international forums, Marat's story became a rallying cry for stricter regulations on private military contractors and greater transparency in conflict zones. However, the fight for justice is far from straightforward. Marat's actions highlighted the immense difficulty of holding powerful organizations accountable, particularly when they are shielded by state interests. Wagner's ties to the Kremlin mean that efforts to prosecute its crimes often run into political and legal roadblocks. The international community, while increasingly aware of Wagner's actions, remains divided on how to address them, with geopolitical rivalries complicating the pursuit of justice. Marat's story also underscores the personal cost of seeking accountability. His own sacrifices, his isolation, the threats to his life, and the betrayals he endured reflect the immense barriers faced by those who stand against powerful institutions. Yet it is precisely these sacrifices that give his call to justice its moral weight. Marat's courage serves as a reminder that accountability is not just about institutions and systems. It is about individuals who are willing to stand up, speak out, and demand change. In addition to exposing Wagner, Marat's story raises critical questions about the broader culture of corruption and impunity within Russia. Wagner is not an isolated phenomenon, but a symptom of a system that prioritizes power and profit over ethics and accountability. Marat's testimony revealed how this culture extends beyond the battlefield, infiltrating political, economic, and social structures. His call to justice is not just about dismantling Wagner. It is about challenging the entire system that allowed it to exist. Marat's actions have also resonated with activists and reformers within Russia and beyond, providing a blueprint for resistance against corruption. His decision to collaborate with human rights organizations and international media demonstrated the power of transparency and collective action. By sharing his story, Marat amplified the voices of others who had been silenced, creating a network of individuals and groups committed to exposing and dismantling corrupt systems. The global implications of Marat's actions extend beyond Russia. His revelations highlight the need for international mechanisms to address the abuses of private military groups and hold their backers accountable. Marat's story has fueled calls for stronger enforcement of international law, more rigorous oversight of private contractors, and greater support for whistleblowers who risk everything to expose the truth. Yet, Marat's call to justice is not just about policy changes or legal action. It is about a deeper reckoning with the values that underpin society. His story challenges individuals and institutions to confront the compromises and complicities that enable corruption to thrive. It asks us to consider the cost of silence and the responsibility we all bear in creating systems that prioritize human dignity and accountability. Marat Gabidullin's journey is far from over, His fight for justice continues, inspiring others to take up the mantle and ensuring that the truths he revealed cannot be buried. His actions remind us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice can spark a movement. His call to justice is not just a demand for accountability. It is a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of truth, and a reminder that change is possible, even in the darkest of times. Marat's story also brings into focus the power of international solidarity. His partnership with human rights organizations and journalists showed that while individuals can ignite movements, they require networks of support to sustain them. Marat's call to justice isn't just a personal fight. It's a collective effort that invites others, governments, activists, and ordinary citizens, to play their part in dismantling the systems of corruption and secrecy that sustain organizations like Wagner. His bravery demonstrates that while the journey toward justice may be long and fraught with challenges, it is a journey worth taking, for it lays the foundation for a more transparent, accountable, and just world. Life after whistleblowing has been a complex and unrelenting battle for Marat Gabidullin. He lives under constant threat, knowing that his decision to expose Wagner's secrets has made him a target for powerful forces that want to silence him. Yet, despite the immense challenges, Marat continues to fight, not with weapons, as he once did, but with words, courage, and a steadfast commitment to justice. Marat now resides in a state of forced exile, having left Russia to ensure his safety. Far from the life he once knew, his days are marked by vigilance and a calculated awareness of the risks he faces. He has had to adapt to a life in the shadows, moving carefully to avoid those who would harm him. Every public appearance, every interview, and every statement he makes carries an inherent danger. But Marat persists, driven by the belief that the truth must prevail. Despite the hardships, Marat has embraced his role as an advocate for justice and transparency. His collaborations with human rights organizations and investigative journalists have deepened, providing him with platforms to continue his work. Through these partnerships, Marat helps shed light on the ongoing activities of Wagner and other private military groups. He works tirelessly to expose the systemic corruption and exploitation he once witnessed firsthand, using his unique perspective as a former insider to add credibility and depth to these efforts. Marat's resilience is a defining feature of his post-whistleblowing life. The isolation, the threats, and the constant pressure would have broken many, but Marat's determination remains unshaken. His commitment to the cause has earned him respect and admiration from activists, journalists, and ordinary people around the world who see in him a symbol of courage and integrity. For Marat, the fight for justice is no longer just about exposing Wagner. It's about ensuring that others do not suffer the same exploitation and abuse that he and his comrades endured. Through public speaking and written accounts, Marat continues to share his story. His memoirs and interviews have reached international audiences, amplifying his voice and bringing global attention to the issues he fights for. Marat's words are a powerful reminder of the human cost of corruption and impunity, forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truths that underpin these systems. His story serves as both a warning and a call to action, inspiring others to challenge injustice wherever they find it. One of the most hopeful aspects of Marat's life after whistleblowing is the impact he has had on others. His courage has emboldened former operatives and victims of similar organizations to come forward, breaking the silence that has long protected such groups. Marat has become a mentor and confidant to many of these individuals, offering support and guidance as they navigate the difficult path of speaking out. In this way, his actions have created a ripple effect, fostering a growing network of voices united in the fight against corruption. Marat's advocacy extends beyond the immediate issues of Wagner and private military contractors. He has become an outspoken critic of the broader systems that enable such organizations to thrive. Through his work, he highlights the need for stronger international regulations, greater accountability, and increased support for whistleblowers. Marat's vision is not just to dismantle Wagner, but to build a world where organizations like it cannot exist, where power is held accountable, and justice is not a privilege but a right. While his journey has been fraught with danger and sacrifice, Marat remains a symbol of hope. His story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of truth. Marat's unwavering commitment to justice inspires others to believe that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. For him, the fight is not just about exposing the past, it's about shaping a future where integrity triumphs over corruption and where no one is above accountability. Marat's life after whistleblowing is far from easy, but it is a life of purpose. Every step he takes, every word he speaks, is a reminder that courage can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. Marat Gabidullin's journey is far from over, but his resilience and hope light the way for others, proving that one voice, armed with the truth, can inspire a movement. Marat Gabidullin's story is more than just a tale of whistleblowing. It is a profound lesson in the power of courage and the transformative impact of truth. His journey from loyal commander to defiant whistleblower highlights the immense strength it takes to stand against powerful systems, even when the cost is personal. It reminds us that the fight for justice often begins with a single voice, but its echoes can inspire a chorus of change. Marat's courage lies not just in exposing the truth, but in enduring the isolation, threats, and betrayals that followed. His decision to speak out wasn't driven by a lack of fear. It was an acknowledgement of the cost of silence. Through his actions, Marat has shown that standing for what is right is rarely easy, but it is always necessary. His bravery is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the lengths to which an individual can go to uphold their principles. The power of truth, as demonstrated by Marat's revelations, is undeniable. By exposing the inner workings of Wagner, Marat disrupted the narrative of secrecy and impunity that had long protected the organization. His story has shed light on the exploitation, corruption, and violence that operate unchecked in the shadows, forcing the world to confront these realities. Truth, as Marat has shown, is a weapon more powerful than any force of intimidation. It has the capacity to challenge systems, demand accountability, and inspire others to act. Marat's journey also underscores the importance of holding systems accountable. Wagner is not just a rogue entity, it is a symptom of larger issues, including the unchecked power of private military groups and the complicity of governments that enable them. Marat's story is a call to action for individuals, institutions, and nations to demand greater transparency, stronger regulations, and a commitment to justice. Systems thrive in darkness, and Marat's actions have shown how exposing their inner workings is the first step toward dismantling them. But the lessons of Marat's story extend beyond Wagner or any single organization. His journey challenges all of us to confront our own roles in the systems that surround us. Whether through silence, complacency, or complicity, we all contribute to the perpetuation of injustice. Marat's courage serves as a reminder that change begins with accountability, not just for those at the top, but for everyone who has the power to make a difference, no matter how small. As we reflect on Marat's journey, the question arises: what can we do to ensure his sacrifices were not in vain? The answer lies in our willingness to act. For those in positions of power, it means creating and enforcing laws that hold private military groups accountable. For institutions, it means supporting whistleblowers and ensuring their safety. For individuals, it means refusing to turn a blind eye to injustice, using our voices, votes, and resources to demand change. Marat Gabidullin's story is not just his own. It is a mirror reflecting the potential for courage within all of us. It reminds us that one voice can spark a movement, that truth can illuminate even the darkest corners, and that accountability is a cornerstone of justice. His actions have shown that the fight for a better world is a shared responsibility, one that requires each of us to confront our fears, stand up for what is right, and support those who do the same. The world needs more Marat Gabidullins, individuals willing to speak the truth, no matter the cost. His story challenges us to ask ourselves, when the moment comes to stand for justice, will we have the courage to act? As viewers, as citizens, as members of a global community, we have a choice. Let Marat's journey inspire us to choose accountability over apathy, action over silence, and courage over fear. The fight for justice is far from over. There are still systems to challenge, truths to uncover, and lives to protect. Marat's story is a call to all of us to take part in this fight, to ensure that those who stand for justice are not standing alone. Let his courage ignite your own, and let his truth remind you of the power you hold to create change. The time to act is now. Together, we can build a world where justice is not a dream, but a reality.